The Running Man begins in the dystopian future of 2017 where world economy has collapsed, resources are low, and what makes it even worse is that music, art, and communications are on the censored list. Thanks to the game show called The Running Man, the government was ruled by an iron hand, and what makes it even worse is that extreme methods are necessary. Benjamin Richards is an LAPD officer and a helicopter pilot, and with him were Lieutenant Saunders and his men, and they're flying a helicopter to Bakersfield, California. Then, when Ben spotted 1,500 civilians engaging a food riot, the dispatch told him to, quote, do away with them, even though despite the fact that Ben said that the citizens were unarmed at the time. So Ben refused. Long story short, after that fight in the helicopter, one of Saunders' men decides to knock out Ben, and that, my friends, is how Ben is framed for the Bakersfield massacre, which he was falsely accused of. 18 months later, Ben and the rest of the prisoners are at the Wilshire Detention Center. It's a prison that is surrounded by the guards. Worse than that, the prisoners are equipped with the explosive restraint collars, and if the satellite deadline is not down, the prisoner's head will explode. The other two prisoners are with Ben are William and Harold. Unbeknownst to one of the prison's guards, Harold was watching the guard punching in the code for the satellite deadline. Back with Harold, he gives the signal to William and Ben to engage a prison fight to distract the guards. While that's going on, that gives Harold enough time to repeat the code that the guard used, but nothing happened. When Ben showed up, Harold said that there's a problem. The prison's walls are denying the codes for the satellite deadline, so Ben suggests to have Harold try it from the outside. Meanwhile, outside, Harold tries again to shut down the satellite's deadline while the rest of the prisoners are continuing to have a gunfight with the prison's guards. Chico, meanwhile, thought that the sonic deadline was down, but unfortunately that's not the case, so Chico's head exploded. Finally, Harold shuts down the satellite deadline, and when that happened, Ben, William, and all the other prisoners had made their escape. Later that night in Los Angeles, after William, Ben, and Harold had successfully escaped, they made up with Mick, the leader of the resistance, and Stevie. Well, Harold pleaded his case that if the satellite uplink and its code were found, because the plan is they can expose the government and reveal the truth. Well, in Mick's case, even if it were true, the uplink and its code just couldn't be found anywhere. The next morning when the truck arrived, Harold and William was told by Ben that he's into survival, not politics, and that his brother Edward is planning to get him out of the city, or so he thought. Meanwhile, at ICS, it is said to be one of the best networks in TV history, where all the fans are waiting the arrival of the host of The Running Man, and the most ruthless of all, Damon Killian. As Damon goes inside, he meets up with his assistant Brenda, a janitor named Dan, and goes into the elevator where he meets his head guard Spin. Meanwhile, back with Ben, he had just arrived at the apartment complex and goes into the apartment of his brother Edward. But Ben wasn't even aware that, unfortunately, Edward doesn't live there anymore and that someone else does. Back inside ICS, and that's where, in the control room, Damien meets up with his right-hand tech, Tony. Back at the apartment, Amber Mendez, who is now currently living in the same apartment where Edward Richards used to live, she was working out and watching TV when she saw on the news that Benjamin Richards, who had currently escaped from prison, is at large, on the move, and on the loose. But she had no idea that Ben is actually already at her place. By the time that Amber saw Ben, Ben was asking her if she's the friend of Edward's tenant. By accident, that's when Amber let slip that Edward used to live at this place, but not anymore because a month prior, according to what the government told her, he was taken for re-education. Long story short, Ben told Amber that what they said about him being the Bakersfield butcher was all a lie and he's been framed and set up, but Amber dismissed him and didn't believe him. So meanwhile in Damon's office we have Tony and Brenda and Damon selecting the next candidates for the next Running Man. But there's a problem. According to Damon, none of those candidates are in fact reliable. That is until Damon catches the attention of the recent prison escape with Benjamin Richards just catches his eye. So what was Damon's plan to get Ben as the next contestant? But Brenda declined, but said it was in the contract that it was never allowed for any of them to get military prisoners, as she says in her case. But it doesn't mean, aha, Damon can pull some strings on the way. So back at Amber's apartment with Amber and Ben, although Amber's all tied up but otherwise fine, Ben decided to use Amber's travel pass. And why is that? Well, he wanted to go to Hawaii and then asked her if she would go with him. When Amber asked him why, and of course, Ben was going to say please, and of course, Amber reluctantly agrees. But later on at the airport, that's when Amber accidentally lets slip claiming a case of kidnapping. That causes Ben to go on a run, and during the short-lived chase, the guard ultimately nets him and captures him. Back at the ICS, Ben, now being captured, is face-to-face with Damon, the host of The Running Man. Well, Damon confessed to Ben the reason why Ben is being brought is because he needed a volunteer for the next Running Man show and asked if Ben would do it. Unfortunately, Ben refused, but that doesn't mean Damon had to convince him otherwise. After that, Damon gave Ben the ultimatum: either volunteer for the show or his friends, Harold and William, can go in his place. So that leaves Ben with no choice. Long story short, back with Amber at her apartment, she was watching the news report that said that even though she did escape the hostage situation, but unfortunately, the two agents that by the time that Ben arrived had been shot, which Amber dismissed. Amber should have realized that Ben was telling her the truth, and now she had to pay the price for this costly mistake. So long story short, back with Amber, she had just arrived at ICS talking to Amy. But what Amy doesn't even know is that Amber's now on a mission to clear Ben's name, so she heads off. Anyway, back with Damon, he does what he normally does, go on with the show, and as the saying goes, it's showtime. Back with Amber, after she shows the pass to the guard, she goes through the control room and into the restricted area full of surveillance tapes. Back with Damon, who had introduced Ben to the entire audience, but Ben should have realized right then he's not the only one volunteering, because with him are William and Harold. Back with Amber in the surveillance room, she found a couple of tapes belonging to the Bakersfield massacre that was shown previously. Well, the edited version and the raw footage version. Back with Damon explaining the rules of the game to the audience, that the runners had 3 hours or less to go through all 4 game zones, and they'll need every minute of it because the stalkers will be trailing them, and anything goes. Before the game could begin, that's when Damon was told by Ben that he will be back. So, it's time to start running. Ben goes first into the game zone, and later on William and Harold. Back with Amber in the surveillance room, after pulling a couple of surveillance tapes of the Bakersfield massacre and then hides them where they'll be useful later, that's when before she can leave she was caught in the act. Long story short, Damon had introduced Sub-Zero to the entire audience. Then meanwhile in the game zone, we have Harold, William, and Ben, and they were attacked by Sub-Zero. But fortunately not for long, because Ben in the end kills him, and then William and Ben has set free Harold from the net, and they left the game zone soon after. Long story short, back with Damon, after he learned the bad news that the first stalker's gone, so he decided to send the next 2 into the game zone, but Saw and Dynamo, to go after the runners. Before that can happen, that's when Damon has one more surprise, a mystery contestant, or should I say the 4th contestant to the game, Amber Mendez. Remember, she was caught in the act in the surveillance room, so all 3 of them were sent into the game zone. So back with the 3 runners, well, good news for Harold, he found the satellite uplink, but there's a problem. The relays are pointing into the zone instead of the satellite itself. Well, in William's case, no wonder Mick and his resistant group couldn't find it. because in William's case, nobody goes out there. So back with the stalkers that was sent earlier into the game zone, they're on a mission. So back with the runners, they saw someone coming and so they decided to hide. They thought it was one of the stalkers, but instead it was Amber. So back with the four runners, they were suddenly attacked by the two stalkers, and that causes the runners to split up. We have Amber with Harold and William with Ben. So back with William and Ben, they were attacked by one of the stalkers, Buzzsaw. Well, good news, William says Ben, but then William gets wounded. Back with Harold and Amber, they found the satellite uplink. So all Harold has to do is to crack the code to expose all the government's lies. Back with Ben and Buzzsaw, they were battling each other. And then, long story short, in a very gruesome manner, Ben kills Buzzsaw. Back with Harold and Amber, Harold gives the uplink code to Amber, so that way she can give it to Mick. But then Dynamo comes out of nowhere. Well, bad news, Dynamo kills Harold. Back with Ben, he just sees Amber with Dynamo and he decided to save her, and so that's what he did. So he did what any person would do, decides to distract Dynamo to have him chase Ben. Well, that was until his car got out of control and flipped on its side. Well, Ben refuses to kill Dynamo, so he's out for now. Back with Ben and Amber, they attended to the wounded William. Before William can die, his last words were to Ben to take Amber to Mick, so that she can give the uplink code to him. Back with Damon, he introduces Fireball as the next stalker on the list, and Fireball's sent on his way. So back with Amber and Ben, they were looking everywhere for Mick's broadcast center, if it ever exists. That's when out of nowhere comes Fireball. Next thing you know, Ben and Amber were pursued by the stalker himself. Long story short, back with Amber, she found the corpses of the three runners that had claimed to have won the last season. Unfortunately, that's not clearly the case because when Fireball shows up, he just lets slip that unfortunately they lost. But good news at the last minute, Amber is saved thanks to Ben, and then he finally kills Fireball. Meanwhile, in the ICS control room, we have Spin the head guard, Tony the right-hand tech, Brenda, Damon's assistant, and Damon himself. Captain Freedom, who was a retired stalker and a 10-time champ, appears in the control room. When he refused to give in to Damon's ruthless methods, he decided to leave, so he was escorted out. Long story short, right-hand tech Tony decides to pull out the last-minute resource by projecting digital doubles. Back with Amber and Ben, with good news they found Mick and the broadcast center. Ben pleaded his case with Mick that it would have been nice if Mick and his group could have helped him. But Mick pleaded his case to say if they had, then William and Harold would have died for nothing, so they couldn't be risked being seen by the government. Luckily for Amber, she has the uplink code that was about to be given to Mick from Harold. Long story short, now Ben's really upset because he just found out what Killian did. That's because Killian was unaware that their real selves are officially alive. When Amber pleaded her case with Ben, and now they can finally leave and do whatever they want, but Ben tells Amber that the government wouldn't allow it. In Ben's case, he will be tracked down and so will Amber, for real. It's now time for a plan to be put into action. Thanks to Amber pulling out the surveillance tapes of the Bakersfield massacre, told you they'll come in handy later, she gives them to Mick. Long story short, meanwhile back at ICS, Mick's group along with Amber and Ben decided to split up. So Stevie went with Amber and half of the group, while the rest of the half of the group went with Ben. Long story short, thanks to Mick and the broadcast center, the uplink satellite has been jammed. Back with Damon, he's now in serious trouble because, yes, it's true, the audience now realize that he's been lying to everyone. including the Bakersfield Massacre, which Ben was falsely accused of just 18 months before. Back at the ICS control room, Stevie and the rest of the group had stopped Tony and Brenda. Long story short, back with the audience, they were in shock because they now realized the truth. That's when Ben and his group came out of nowhere, and now there's a battle going on. So Ben, along with his men, are battling the guards and evacuating the audience. Long story short, after the security guard and Dynamo were killed off thanks to Amber, back with Damon, who was all alone since Ben had killed all the security guards and he and the rest of the group got everybody else out, it is now time for Ben's final act of revenge. Suddenly, Spin the head guard shows up, but he refused to talk to Ben. So now it's just Damon and Ben. Long story short, after Ben had pleaded his case with Killian, he puts him in the rocket sled. Finally, as Ben's act of revenge, Killian was sent into the game zone just like what the runners did. And that led to the result of the rocket sled going out of control inside the game zone, causing it to crash, killing Damon Killian instantly. As the film comes to an end, the audience celebrates in victory. As for Ben, he's now proclaimed innocent and is cleared of all charges. And even better, he gets to hook up with Amber.